Valuation's a very difficult task for early stage exploration properties. The risk is high, therefore the range of outcomes is quite wide, and so it's very hard in doing a valuation. It's very hard to land on a single number, but I feel quite comfortable talking about a range of potential outcomes, and the higher the risk, the wider that range will be. But sort of understanding the risks in exploration and trying to if someone's really promoting something at one end of the spectrum, trying to bring that back into, well, what are people comfortable about here? And don't just talk about the upside, talk about what the potential downside is as well.
Deb Lord is a director and principal consultant at VRM, where she specializes in resource and reserve governance, valuation of exploration assets, independent technical reporting, and exploration targeting. In this conversation, Deb runs me through her career as a geologist, first for WMC, then Placer, then as a consultant for SRK for 18 years, and then 4 years as the head of resource governance for BHP. Now, I don't do a lot of valmin or valuation work myself, so it was a great opportunity to ask a few questions, as she really has a wealth of experience in this space. We talk about the difficulty to quantify and to express prospectivity into words, cover some thoughts on valuation models, and then I sidetrack things a little by jumping into the learning from mistakes area, and particularly the regulator's role in that discussion, and Deb's experience on the PCC and dealing with transgressions, and should we name and shame, and so on. Now, I might have lent into this last topic a little bit too far, but we lend back on her current views and involvement in the updates to the JORC and VELMIN codes, and we talk about the role of ESG in reasonable prospects for eventual extraction of resources, and whether some of the current resources will keep their place in our balance sheets. Are we really going to still be mining coal in 50 years? Like many other people I've been talking to, Deb also raises the issue with geoeducation, a place where we find common ground of what might need to happen to improve things a bit. As usual, if I've left anything on the table, then please let me know in the comments so we can come back to this in a future discussion. Let's get into it. Hey Deb, how are you doing?
Good, René, how are you?
Yeah, good. Hey, look, I was keen to talk to you. I don't know if you listened to some of the other chats I've been having recently, but so much overlap between us being geologists, I guess, and it being a geology-focused channel in general. We only just recently ran into each other, and I was having a quick peek at your LinkedIn background. It's understand trajectory that you've sort of come from. Working on VELMIN, you worked as a consultant for many years, almost as long as RSE has been running. So always like chatting to people who have worked in the industry and consulting for a long time, compare notes. But also your work on VELMIN, obviously, and you do some work for AusMM on the PCC. You sit on the VELMIN committee, so I thought fantastic opportunity to have a chat. So thanks so much for making the time.
Yeah, thanks, René. It's good to have a conversation.
Yeah, well, look, like I said, there's not much to prepare because I'm sure that we'll drift left and right and discuss all sorts of things that I never was intending to discuss, but that's the joy. And that's sort of where I wanted to go. I've got a few things definitely in some of our mutual interest at the moment that I'd love to chat about. But again, as I tend to do, I'd love to hear a bit of a background about your foray into geology. I saw you two started with Western Mining Corporation. So maybe you can give us an overview of how you rolled into geology and then how you decided to go from working for big companies, WMC, and what did you do? Placer, I think.
Placer, Placer.
And then going to consulting and how that change was. And similar to John Ronsku, I was just recently talking to as well, then going back into a small consulting group, and as to quote him, no boss is no employee. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that whole sort of spectrum of jobs that you've run through.
Yeah. So I got offered a job at university by Western Mining. They used to come around the universities and interview all the honours graduates. And so I grew up in Melbourne, and then my first job was in Kalgoorlie in Western Australia. And I've never lived back in Melbourne since then, which I think, would have horrified my family if they'd known that at the time. So my first job was in Kalgoorlie doing gold and nickel exploration based out of Western Mining's exploration division there. And then my family had all grown up overseas, so I decided I needed to do some travelling. And so after working in Kalgoorlie for a couple of years, and maybe the isolation of that as well, I decided to take a year off and I went to Europe and bought a car and travelled around Europe for a year.
Nice.
Which was great. And then I came back to Perth and I could have taken a job with Western Mining again, but I wanted to really try and stay in Perth, and that was when an opportunity came up with Placer Dome, or Placer Pacific, I think they were at the time. So I took that job with Placer, which was again in the goldfields around Laverton. I lived in a tent, sort of 3 weeks on, 1 week off for a few years, and discovered a gold mine that they subsequently ran through the Granny Smith plant. So that was a great experience, but it was pretty exhausting as well. And I wanted to travel again, and I tried to organise getting an overseas posting with Placer, but they couldn't guarantee me anything before I left Australia. And at that point, I'd met Etheridge, Henley and Williams. It was became SRK Consulting. And they said, we're looking to try and get some geologists into South America. Are you up for it? And I was like, absolutely.
Yeah.
So that was my start of consulting. So I moved from Perth then to Santiago in Chile, and I spent the next few years working. I actually ended up working mostly in Brazil because of the geological similarities to the Archean, but I also did some work through Chile and Peru and travelled a lot there too. So, So
and
that was my start.
You spent a long time as a consultant. That was 17 years, or give or take, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So the first 3 of those were in Chile, and then my husband actually was working in South America as well, and his job got transferred back to Australia. So we did a bit of travelling and then came back to Australia, and I started with SRK back in Perth. And that was really when I started getting involved in more valuation work.
Yeah.
So I'd previously largely been a field geologist, but by that time I was probably getting close to 30, thinking about kids, how's this going to work? So that was, and consulting really suited me having children because I could work pretty flexibly, still do really interesting work. And I sort of found myself moving towards the valuation space at that point, probably.
Yeah. And that's where you do most of your work in now with VRM, right? Could you? So is that the entire focus of VRM, or do you sort of take on anything that comes in a resource reserve governance space?
Yeah, it's mostly in resource reserve governance, but more on the resource end than the reserve end. So through my time at SRK, I got involved. I mean, I did all sorts of different projects in all sorts of places. I was thinking about sending my resume through because, there's a lot of projects that I've worked on all around the world. Also, when I was with Placer, I worked in North America for a few years, for a few months, about half a year. So I've worked through North America, South America. I've seen a lot of projects of a lot of companies, as I'm sure most consultants have.
Well, isn't that really the benefit? And sorry to interrupt, but we've covered that in a few other conversations as well. You know, the best geologist is the one who sees the most rocks and so on. And seeing all these projects, it gives you a huge exposure to to the whole trajectory of
the planet, really.
Yeah, exactly, and not just geology, also, but just projects in general, and how different people or different jurisdictions tackle these projects differently sometimes, and so that's great background.
Absolutely. And the valuation side of things then is sort of another element, I guess. You can review the geology and form an opinion of the geology, but what became interesting to me was how, you communicated that to other professionals, whether they be lawyers or accountants or investors. And so that was my interest in valuation really came from communicating to other discipline areas, and particularly how you communicate the excitement of exploration to a potential investor without being misleading.
Yeah.
And so I set off on the governance and the regulatory path and got involved in ValMin and got involved with the regulators as well, and just, seeing how they came across issues and how we as an industry could be more responsible in how we informed people.
So when you say, I mean, you landed in that space, and I joked about this the other day because I find it a little bit odd that, a geologist who is clearly so passionate about the rocks, and mapping and all those wonderful things, how you land in that sort of that corporate space. And you mentioned communication, because it is intriguing, obviously, is that communication part to various stakeholders, whether it's regulators, but was that the pull, or was there were there problems to solve there? Because I'm very naturally drawn at trying to, I mean, JORC is a classic example, is kind of similar here. Why would you devote time to JORC? Because it's just, text on paper, right? And it's not actually dealing with the rocks as much. But it's very intriguing how that whole process about communication works. What drew you into that space?
So I probably I don't think I landed in it. I think I sort of followed a path that eventually led me into it, sort of thing. So I started out writing prospectuses and communicating, exploration upside to people before I started doing valuation. And when I started doing the valuation work, we'd adopted, this was in SRK, and they had a petroleum division as well. And so we started sort of talking, or we always talked across disciplines, but petroleum used quite a different way to value exploration than what minerals did. So there was a very well-established petroleum model. You looked at the probability of each of the elements in that model being present and multiplied them together to sort of estimate a probability of success. So that's how my interest in valuation started. And I'd look at projects and think, how, what elements of the geological model, what is the geological model the company is using? What elements of it are there, and how likely does that mean they're going to be successful? And one of those things I looked at, I rung Greg Hall, who many people will know, and said, Placer's done a lot of exploration around Laverton, like how many of those prospects that we've found have actually turned into something? And he said, it's a really good question. Why don't we write a paper on it? And so we put together 10 years of Laverton's exploration history, just looking at how many prospects had been drilled, how many of those that were drilled turned into something, what the success was for that decade of exploration.
Is that where the famous triangle image comes from, or?
Yeah, it might be. It might be. We sort of talked about, the exploration pipeline and those pyramids, but we actually were trying to quantify it. We were actually trying to put a number and a probability on it.
So maybe if you don't mind jumping into that one, because I find that really interesting. We write prospectivity reports as geologists, and then all the stuff in the middle about the geology is always, wonderfully written, and you review the reports and it's on the mark and it's great stuff. But then there comes that 2 lines in the end where you have to say something in language about that prospectivity. And you get stuck on words. Is it good prospectivity? Is it just prospective, or is it moderately prospective? What do any of these words mean? And again, as we always joke, you can ask any geologist what do they think, and they'll say it's interesting, and that has an error margin of 500% on it. So how the quantitative aspect is something really interesting, and I dove into that in my chat with John a little bit as well. And he's got this sort of really classic approach to, or system fundamentals to targeting. But how do you express that then without being backed up by numbers and quantitative tools? Can you touch on that?
Yeah, I can touch on it. It's a big topic, but
hey, we're here.
Yeah, look, we're here. So if you have a model for whatever sort of deposit you're looking for. Nickel might be, different to gold, but all those elements that all us field geologists are looking for need to be sort of ranked in some way, shape, or form so that you direct your exploration budget into, the place that you think you've got the best chance of finding something. So I think we're all familiar with those sort of ranking systems, and I guess that's where my valuation interest started out, was trying to then translate high, medium, low, good, bad, indifferent, whatever sort of 1, 2, 3, A, B, C, whatever sort of system you have, into something a bit more numeric that could then inform a valuation. So, the easy way to think of it is in a probabilistic way. 0, there's no chance that you're going to find something. 1 is 100% chance that there's something there, and 50 or 0.5, probability of 0.5 is you don't know. So maybe you haven't got the right information yet. Maybe you haven't done the structural geology. Maybe you haven't drilled a hole. Maybe so taking each of those elements and each area where you've got information and assigning a number where 0.5 is you don't know, greater than 0.5 is more likely than unlikely, and less than 0.5 is more unlikely than likely.
So you're really talking the sort of, classic 90s, early 2000s weights of evidence, a fuzzy logic approach where you really quantify that. I started in that space actually coming into the industry, and I was, the argument is exactly that. You don't have to use words, and you don't have to just listen to a geologist try to explain that layer A is more important than layer B. I mean, the classic matrix approach in Excel still does very well if you just need to come up with something quick and simple, and you have 8 layers and 1 to 5 rankings, and you can get there in a reasonably sensible final ranking pretty quickly, but it's biased at best. But obviously we did discuss on the channel as well with some others the trouble still that sit in that classic weights of evidence and fuzzy logic approach, and these days, and that's a talk that still needs to come out, is the talk with Sean Hood on the machine learning approach to, or the deep learning approach to solving those quantitative riddles, because that takes some of that bias out. And it's really interesting because you're right. I mean, without that quantitative background, and I did try to press John on that a little bit, so if he's listening, maybe we should have another chat. But, you can also overcomplicate it dramatically, and it still comes down to that really deep expertise that the user needs to impress on whatever buttons you press in that computer, right? You need to have a specialist user sitting there. So it's but you can apply it to all these big data sets, and you can bring your geophysics in and actually let that go to work if they're well processed. And now in Australia, I saw that huge Western Australian geochemistry data set coming out a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if you saw that, but that looks spectacular as well. And so really, but then you still have to write it up, and that doesn't change. And I guess you can say the value is more than 0.5, and in a classic indicator kriging approach, that's more than 50%. So it's more likely to be there than not. But But the problem with these sort of probability-based approaches is, they're very sensitive, especially when you start multiplying a lot of numbers together. They're very sensitive to those inputs, and and it becomes quite difficult to precisely measure these things. So I always find it easier to think about it as a ranking tool rather than an actual valuation tool. So in your valuations then, because you got a project, somebody comes to you as a client and says, look, I've got this early stage exploration, here's some information that I have for it. I'd like to come up with a valuation because we want to go to a transaction, or we've got some interest, or whatever the brief might be. How do you try to connect the dots between the quantitative mechanism and the value, or do you still go to the classical valuation methods on money spent and those sort of models?
Yeah, look, I tend to probably have both things in mind, so I'll always be keen to understand how the client and how myself as an independent valuer ranks the various projects. So that's always in the back of my mind. But there are issues with the probabilistic sort of approach to, and also the regulators don't really find that sensitivity very acceptable. So,
Yeah, good point.
they much prefer something that is a bit more, a bit
Proven.
less a bit less nebulous.
Yeah,
So things
interesting.
like comparable market transactions,
Yeah.
or something that's been tested by the market is something that they're much more comfortable with, and it's kind of a bit more consistent and easier for people to get their heads around. So
So you
I
go
always
straight into the
point,
databases. You tap deeply into the
yeah,
S&P
yeah,
databases for your work.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Particularly if something has a resource on it, it's a bit easier to compare
Sure.
resources with other resources.
Yeah.
And if you talk about the probability of there being a resource with X amount of drilling and Y cost, you start treading on, but you haven't got a resource yet,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and potentially being misleading. So you've
Yeah.
got to be very careful about how you communicate.
Well, especially now because I mean, and this is sort of just a thought bubble that came to mind. We're now talking about a JOR code update. There's obviously a lot of time and money going into training and communication of both JORC and Velmin, obviously, the work that you're involved with as well. And we having these not new factors, they're always there, but they were never really looked at, the old ESG, stamp. And I'm sure that you're starting to look at projects where, and I've had this discussion from a resource perspective, and with your BHB experience or whatever, maybe just consulting experience, what's your sense on whether these projects should still, quote unquote, sit on the books, on the balance sheet? And with some of these projects, where, quote unquote, as Bruce Harvey said the other day on the podcast, half of them will never come out of the ground. I mean, that's a pretty bold statement to make from somebody who is, leading the discussion on ESG change. That to me sends alarm bells, and you would run into discussions with clients where you say, look, to be frank, folks, this is going to be difficult in the next 10 years. Does it really have value? Have you encountered some of those issues?
Yeah, definitely. So some really simplistic ones might be, there are companies, a number of companies that have coal mines with a mine life or a reserve life of 50 years. And, I think, are we really going to be mining coal in 50 years? So I think there has to be some modifying factor, for want of a better phrase,
Yeah, yeah,
that overprints, those sorts of things.
yeah.
Yeah.
Because
So
it's really when you're tasked to come up with a valuation, I'm sure that the expectation from the client is never that there is no valuation, that there is always a result. And look, for us as resource consultants, we quite often, as would you, as would anybody else, have that discussion early on so that there's none of those surprises. But you do end up sometimes thinking, after all is said and done, look, on balance, this is actually quite tricky, given where it is in the environmental standards and the laws of the country and so on.
yeah, absolutely. And going forward, I think money, it is going to be interesting to see how Valmin develops with the ESG overprint as well, because I have no doubt that money will head towards projects that have certain ESG credentials,
Yeah.
or projects, properties, mineral assets. And so we are definitely going to have to get our heads around how we incorporate those elements into evaluation.
Do you see that already? Because again, something that you start hearing more often, and it's an argument, a discussion I got into the other day, are all companies bringing in this ESG because they kind of have to and you're dragging them along by the hair screaming, or is everybody that you sense around you in your network saying, no, this is the right thing to do? Because plenty of people are seeing that shift, right? The money is following the conscientious investors out there. And as I was discussing with Bruce, I mean, there's a real, the flow enhancement is going a lot faster in that space at the moment with a lot of companies changing. So The changes are probably coming onto the balance sheets and re-estimations and revaluations pretty soon as well.
Yeah, yeah. Look, I think most geologists do geology because they like earth science. So I think most geologists are pretty passionate about the earth. So I don't, I find it really tricky when people talk about, dirty miners. But because I do think the industry, the resources sector, is quite keen on preserving the environment to the best degree that we can, given that we still want to try and extract metals for various uses, but increasingly going forward to help solve some of the engineering problems around carbon emissions and climate change. So it's tricky. I think it's very difficult. I think responsible resource extraction is fabulous, and trying to make sure that you understand the ore body to the best of your knowledge at the time and mine it in a responsible way rather than just trying to make the maximum profit in the short term may not necessarily be the best way to mine that distribution of whatever metal in the longer term, if you took a longer term view. But unfortunately, most people want to see the returns as quick as possible and may not think about alternative ways that an ore body could be mined to take into account other elements rather than just the monetary side of things. So, but going forward, I think we probably will have to start taking those other elements. They're going to become as important.
So are you seeing the same, obviously JORC is going through this huge process now, and all these aspects are being reviewed, and some of them are being changed and upgraded, if that's the word to choose. And Velmin obviously, will go through this process as well, and I'm sure you're involved with that to a reasonable degree. Are we behind the eight ball, or are we in time with the current environment in terms of where it's sitting in with these upgrades? Are you feeling that we are sort of ahead of the game a little bit? Because sometimes with JORC, there is so much happening, and it's all based on volunteers, and change generally only comes when it's really needed, and then it takes another 3 years to push it through, and the world around us is still changing through that, and by the time the JORC code comes through, there's probably already other aspects that we need to review from you. And either JORC or Velmin, but as a question, are we in the right time for changes there, or?
I think things are going to constantly change, and so I think trying to capture everything within Velmin or JORC at a point in time is like you say, you might capture it today and tomorrow it's going to be out of date.
Yeah.
So the way Velmin has worked, and I don't know whether this will happen with JORC, but is to reference other important material that you need to stay on top of. So, I wouldn't like to see JORC try and introduce an ESG framework that is the be-all and end-all, because the world is moving, the rest of the ESG landscape is moving at a faster pace than what 10-year updates of JORC can hope to achieve. So that would be my expectation. With the last Velmin update, there was a lot happening in the regulatory space. So there was a lot of information coming out from the regulators about how to inform the market on scoping studies and production targets, and all of that stuff evolved quite rapidly right at the same time as we were trying to put a Velmin update out. And so we just tried to communicate to resource professionals that they needed to be aware of these other things and stay up to date on them.
Now you're feeling that we're oversteering a little bit sometimes. I mean, this is definitely, the competence debate, and that's why we obviously briefly connected a little while ago. That is happening at the moment, and the argument is constantly, are we not over-regulating things? But you hear about, things change, the industry changes, regulatory space changes, so we have to go along with the change. But depending on who you talk to, some people think, look, things are fine as they are. Have you got a political or non-political answer to what you think in terms of regulation, over-regulation? I mean, what's the balance?
Yeah, look, I think things like JORC and Velmin give us as an industry the opportunity to describe things in a manner that makes more sense to other geologists or engineers. You know, if we've got to try and read a legal piece of regulation that the government puts out, it's pretty challenging for us then to apply that
Yeah.
to our own backyard. So I think JORC and Velmin, you know, it's great to have these updates that try and explain things that the regulators are seeing and they're concerned about. We can have those discussions with the regulators to understand where they're coming from, why it's problematic for them, and then try and communicate that back to the resources sector.
Yeah.
You know, in a way, the more regularly we do these updates, the easier they are. You know, if you don't update something for 10 years and a lot of stuff's changed, it's like starting again. So,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I, you know,
Yeah.
I don't know. It's yeah.
Yeah, no, look, that's fair enough. And I wondered that with your role with BHP, you know, you probably worked at a pretty high level projects across the globe. And then maybe mix in some of the, PCC Professional Conduct Committee experience. I mean, one thing that I'm always interested in is the difference in how we deal jurisdictionally with transgressions, right? I mean, and we had a number of high-profile cases in Canada, and they go right out on the old blackboard for everybody to see and notice what was not the way to do it. And as I argue, that allows us to see how not to do it. And I find that still difficult in Yorkland to, and I understand the construct obviously, but how do we, well, first question maybe, do you see an argument for either the sort of Canadian approach to dealing with transgressions versus what we are doing through the competent person and the PCC and the ethics committee, and then maybe once every blue moon a name will come out if it's really, really bad. But my argument is we're not allowed to learn from our mistakes here, and I find that really, that was always actually really my, coming back to the start of the discussion, that was actually my quest into this space. It wasn't actually, oh, this JORC stuff sounds exciting, let's get into that stuff. It was like, how does this stuff work? And why can't I find anything about any of how this stuff should work? I mean, the JORC code is, and people say read the JORC code, which is all well and good, but there is so much more than that. I mean, the nuance, the gray areas, as much as people deny there will be gray, there are no gray areas. There's plenty of interpretation around some of this stuff, right? So I'm interested in your perspective, having worked at that high level, both as a consultant in SRK and then at BHP, then having your involvement with Velmin and JORC and so on. How do you see anything that we can learn from Canada in terms of, or just in general, your thoughts on how we could do better there?
Yeah, look, I mean, whenever I'm giving a presentation on Velmin, it always starts out with the history of, why it's there and some pretty dramatic market transgressions, let's say, or, people got overexcited about projects or completely fraudulent in some cases. So I think, those are definitely lessons that need to be learnt from, but they're fairly unusual, touch wood, let's hope. And so I think there is more opportunity to talk about and learn from smaller things, really. And I think we've got to get better at communicating as an industry and between us and the regulators about how we can do that. So, I've just finished a Velmin, the fourth Velmin module, online module that the AusIMM's been running. And right at the end of it, we talk about case studies that ASIC puts out. And they are, once a quarter, ASIC, the Australian Securities Investments Commission, they put out they have a corporate finance liaison meeting. It's mostly for the accounting industry and the corporate finance industry, but they, maybe once or twice a year, they come across something in JORC and Velmin land that they're not entirely comfortable with. And they use this corporate finance liaison meeting to describe a hypothetical or probably an actual example, but they try and not make it too obvious, but just describe the situation. And they put out this case study, what they've seen, how it was dealt with, and what we should learn from it. And I think those sorts of things we should be trying to capture more of. The PCC operates under confidentiality. It's a pretty small industry. It's very difficult to not name and shame. But I think there is also an opportunity for us to use it in a more educative way and say, well, actually, we came across these types of things, and do you know that this is not acceptable? We should be doing this.
Well, and sorry, maybe because I find that place really interesting because not many people are aware that ESIC is doing that. That's, I think, a pretty easy statement to make. Then you could also be surprised that a bunch of lawyers actually agree to put that, to sort of blackline some parts and run the risk that you actually put somebody accidentally in the bad box. But be that what it may. The AusMM publishes every year some pretty vanilla summary of some of the transgressions, and there are, as Steve Hunt calls them, speeding tickets, right? I mean, there are competent person statements forgotten, blah blah blah. I try to keep an eye on the market on a weekly basis to see how many of these the ASX actually pulls up, and they're all fairly, they're in that box of the speeding tickets. Where the train wrecks happen, that is always a complex mix of issues. And I discussed the other day, there is an argument from some people that Dacian, some of the issues that they had a couple of years, that was perhaps a competent person issue. But when you start unpacking that, it isn't just the resource geologist using the wrong variogram. It's just not. It is a very very well layered, or a Swiss cheese kind of situation where a number of things are stacking up. But what you said before, it really appeals to me. I am very committed to trying to find a better way to set examples of both good and bad practice without naming and shaming. Right, that has to be the industry's drive here. And Monograph 30, from a best practice perspective, was an okay effort, but it's still, it's very high level. A lot of the papers in there, I don't really get everything that I need out of that. And I don't think, obviously, confidentiality must be maintained. So I think that because you can't put names out there and get it wrong, because you're destroying people's careers, and that's absolutely fundamental to what we do as an institute and as an industry. But somewhere I think there is a good case to make for effort of a group in working out what some of these issues were without putting the names out there, and saying what went wrong with this project, what multi-layered. And there is this paper, and I can't remember now, every time I raise it I say, I can't remember it, so I should probably look it up. But there is this paper that analyzes why these projects fail, and it is 24% is at the reserve stage, and only 15% is resources and data. And there's a little bit, I should find the link and put it in the description here in the video, but I'm sure you're familiar with it. But I like those kind of studies where you can go to people and say, hey, don't be that person. These are the things to look out for. And that's the reason I got into this space, to try and figure out what is wrong and what is right. And you can't tell just by looking at the public announcements. You need to spend a lot of time on that. There is no book, there is no publication. There aren't really any discussions on that topic, like a channel like this. It's all just mysterious and opaque. So there you go. Sorry, I'll just insert a little bit of my own flavor, but we've never really sort of conversed over that over a glass of wine, I guess. But that's I picked up on that point that you made. Do you think that's possible, or what would need to happen to achieve that?
Yeah, look, I mean, the ASIC examples, I can send you through a couple so you can get a bit of an idea from them. But that type of thing would not be difficult to do, and we can communicate it either through the AIG or the AusIMM. Even if we put out half a dozen examples, and we maybe had a lawyer look at them just to make sure we're not getting ourselves in trouble.
That's always good.
Just to make sure that we really are just educating the industry. And so, because the other thing that happens is a lot of this happens, we're not able to see it. So if we're able to get some feedback from how ASIC review documents, how the ASX review documents, and what they're looking for. And again, I think, a lot of it is around communication, more open communication. We're all wanting, 99.9% of people are trying to do the best thing. But, we all have different perspectives. We all read different things. We all have a slightly different view on the world. And so just pointing out in some cases where, someone's view might not be consistent with the rest of the industry,
But do you think that ASIC has
everybody?
Yeah, sure. No, that's a good point to make. But do you think that ASIC has the capability, the technical capability to analyze it? Because I understand that they pick up that, information sheet 216 or 218, whatever it was, and there's a production target, and they're basing it on a little bit too much inferred, and and we can learn from that. And sure, they can analyze that with their, regulatory hats on. But some of these projects, and I don't want to single out the wrong one. So if I name any, then it's only because there has been a discussion around that. It's not necessarily because there has been anything necessarily wrong with it. But as I said, there are deeply layered net of issues that usually come into play. And as you would have picked up from the competence discussion that the AusIMM is leading together with AIG, is that just the competent person, or is there, and particularly with sort of mining companies, there's a whole layering. There's management involved, there's engineers involved, there's geologists, metallurgists involved. Then there is money involved, and there's time involved, time pressure, and all of these things are work. And then there's consultants, and then there's auditors, and everybody has an opinion. But this thing needs to come out. A decision gets made somewhere. And at that point, and I'm speaking from the resource geologist perspective here, not only because I am a geologist, but that one is closest to me to understand and feel. At that point in time, you play a little role in a big process. What would ASIC know about that? And to what degree is it their role to actually really talk to the board of directors of that company and not pick such a big fight? I'm just putting this out there. I'm not making any statement or claim here, just for the viewers who will probably get worked up by these comments. Get excited by these comments. But I'm truly asking, does ASIC have the capability to analyze these projects deeply enough to quote unquote point the finger in the right, or point a gun in the right direction? We can all see that the plane has crashed. The plane is down, the smoke is coming, the wings have broken, but the discussion on where it went wrong, and quote unquote who's to blame, I think we need to see all those pieces separately, and all we want to know, and I think that's not clear to all the parties involved in this particular debate. And again, sorry for dragging it there, because I had no intention to go into that discussion too deeply. But all we want to do is prevent it and learning, because as you say, 99.9999% of all the professionals are trying to do the right thing. So we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater in a way. Sorry, there's a lot there to unpack, but I'm getting all excited about discussing the topic now, and love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, well, look, I don't, ASIC and the ASX and the regulators are regulators. They're not technical. Don't necessarily have a technical background. I know from time to time they try and bring people in with that technical background.
Ivy, yeah.
But they are good at understanding market communications, and they are lawyers, and so I think they are quite used to pulling apart complex issues. But maybe the piece that's missing is then this forum where we communicate. This is what they're saying. How as an industry professional does that play out in the professional space? So, they can only see, if they read a JORC announcement, they can only see one competent person. So where else can they look, really? So I think, JORC has to go down the path, and Valmin's sort of there already, saying there's not one person that signs off on, this complex project. It is a team. And so there might be one person that's taking the overall accountability for the Valmin report, but there's areas where that person doesn't have the expertise, and they probably need to rely on other specialists in order to reach their conclusions. So I think just being really clear about who, what, and where is also really important. With these big projects that go wrong, I mean, they are big projects. They're not simple. They're not. It's not like you say. It's not one person doing the wrong thing or making a mistake or whatever. And even if they did, we should learn from that rather than sort of hit people over the head with anything. So, yeah, it is how we analyse these sort of situations is tricky. But the regulators, I think, and things like Valmin and JORC are aiming to prevent them, really, by trying to do things like, has an audit or a review of this resource been done? Should that be something that is done routinely before the first time a resource is announced?
But we don't even have ISO standards for audits. I do. No. I mean, I do a fair few audits, and for reasonably sized companies out there. And if you look at the auditing, if a geologist goes to a lab, we all know how we audit a lab. We walk around, and the lab manager shows us the prep station. Oh, that's nice. Click. There's a bit of dust there, and then we move along, and that was your audit. That's got nothing to do with an audit, and there are no standards for that. And if you look for it, if you Google it, or if you look in the monograph 30, how do you audit a big operation, and what do you look for? What is the interaction between the data quality management systems, your SOPs, your verification of data? There is nothing there. So you have to really go and download an ISO document, a standard from a different industry, to get some guidance of what you really need to do to put that signature there. And that's the real the vagueness that I think in this geology space is probably frustrating for us ourselves and for people watching, because I feel like what we're doing, the plane has crashed and we're just grabbing the pilot and hitting him over the head because his plane has crashed. But if a plane crashes, we have these intricate, detailed analysis of what happened, and we want to know exactly what little rubber ring where failed to lead to what cascading set of circumstances, so that we know. And somewhere, I think, if these transgressions happen, there needs to be a shared responsibility of, quote unquote, all involved to be contributing in a mandatory process of a review to understand what's gone wrong here. Because otherwise, I find this competence debate frustrating, because we'll never come out of it otherwise. We're all just staring at each other and talking about geologists, making up stuff and hitting them over the head because something went wrong on the other side. But look, I do take your point, but yeah.
I mostly work in the exploration space, and so things that set off alarm bells for me are the biggest footprint or the largest, or anything with EST written on the end of it, overly enthusiastic language, or people putting out 5 resource updates in a year or something like that. To me, people that are overly enthusiastic about promoting their special project, to me that rings alarm bells, and I start thinking, okay, how much pressure is the competent person feeling in those situations? How much, how driven is the company by needing to deliver this, that, or the other? We talked when I was in BHP, we talked about, how many geologists have KPIs or key performance indicators that relate to the size of the resource.
That point gets raised often, yeah.
It's putting a lot of pressure on that person to deliver something that maybe the information they have is not fully supporting. So I think those sorts of things in the exploration space are things that start ringing alarm bells for me. And so when you see those things, the other challenge I have at times as a Valmin writer is that I've got to be able to shout those out and or not shout them out, but bring them to attention of people and say that this is stepping beyond. Valuation's a very difficult task for early stage exploration properties. The risk is high, therefore the range of outcomes is quite wide, and so it's very hard in doing evaluation. It's very hard to land on a single number, but I feel quite comfortable talking about a range of potential outcomes, and so the higher the risk, the wider that range will be. But sort of understanding the risks in exploration and trying to if someone's really promoting something at one end of the spectrum, trying to bring that back into, well, what are people comfortable about here? And don't just talk about the upside, talk about what the potential downside is as well. And
could you talk a bit more about that risk, and perhaps also from the angle from a consultant, and perhaps the legal risk for yourself as an operator? Because I'm sure you said you're not so much in the resource space, but as a group of resource consultants, we need to be careful. Not to overpromise and underdeliver, but we also want to get it right, obviously, but we need to be conservative, because if you get it wrong on the upside, you're in trouble. Plenty of groups have gotten into court over their resource work. It can be a litigious space there. Do you feel that is any different in valuation, or is there a line to walk as a company with a policy, as like where the bigger groups will tend to be more conservative, and plenty of smaller groups might look for that smaller consultant who is a bit more willing to stretch the line a little bit? How do you see that?
Yeah. So I don't know if this is going to answer the question, but I think uncertainty and risk really does need to be communicated. So maybe a way of the way I think about it, and the way the JORC people can think about it is, exploration targets have to be reported in terms of a range of tonnes and a range of grade or quality. So it always fascinates me that, you can estimate an exploration target in this big range, but as soon as you decide that it's an inferred resource, you report a single number. Now, to me, that's not communicating the risk or the range of potential outcomes. So I think we've got the probabilistic way of describing things or talking about uncertainty and ranges has to be communicated more effectively.
Isn't that interesting? Because I think you hit the nail on the head there. And I was talking to Jeff Lyman the other day, who's a sampling expert, and he is really deeply into his stats, and he came into this space wondering why our industry, and he didn't come out of a mining background, why we don't actually report our error margins around the observations that we make and the data that comes out. And that's fascinating. Absolutely. Because in all this resource work, we go through this endless process of sampling and data and accuracy and precision and variance, and then the block model has variance, and we're very good with variance. And then the final number comes out. No, that's the number, right? And I mean, I get why you can't use a range, because you have to put something in, the downstream models, and you got to work with a number, so putting a range in. But then again, you would obviously stress test that with both the lower number and the big number and everything in between. And we're not doing that very well. And it is interesting that if you really look at the inferred resource, is it really plus or minus 25, 30, whatever people would make it, or is it really more plus than minus, because nobody's going to sit over? I find it an intriguing space after all that work, that you basically just go, well, that will be it. That's maybe there's some work to be done.
Yeah, I think trying to communicate what the error margin is, or what elements are particularly sensitive in defining that resource. So, and then people can say, okay, well, if it is grade, or if it's metal price, or if it's something else.
Well, Table 1 does ask you about you
Yeah,
must talk about the accuracy and the precision of your model, but how many statements have if I just, again, it's just a thought, but how many statements have I seen where that discussion has actually happened?
yes,
There's always some sort of line about the competent person thinks this is the best model that he or she has ever made, and that, and that's probably not really close to truth, but interesting. Yeah, maybe
yes,
some
yeah,
quantification required there. But hey, look, before we move to the end here, because I think I could probably keep talking about this sort of stuff for hours. What's on your mind? I mean, what are you working on other than that sort of development work? That you're is there anything else that you're seeing out there that is you think this needs to be discussed at some point? What's
yeah.
keeping you up
Look,
at night?
I'm sort of thinking, where's the next generation of mining professionals coming from, really?
Yeah,
So that's something that I think about quite often in the valuation space,
yeah,
but more broadly as well in the sort of in the wider industry, and how are universities working to attract people to mining? And as an industry, I find that
yeah.
a complex thing to deal with.
Well,
So
because you
that's
said,
something that keeps me awake.
yeah, no, look, and for us all, because again, going back to the start, I think John was explaining that with WMC, they had this student or this plan, I can't remember what it was called now, but indeed to offer these master's and PhD theses and really, back in the day, incentivize people to, do good science and come on board and that link with the universities, and we don't have that much, but I agree with you, and I was talking to a few people on this channel about that future workforce problem, and it's
Yeah,
definitely one of my most difficult questions as well. So I think we're all thinking
yeah.
about the same problems there. And
And I
have you
think,
got answers,
no, I haven't. Well, suggestions maybe, but
suggestions?
yeah, I've got two daughters, and they haven't really been interested in science. They sort of
Yeah.
have, and they have had opportunities to do science. And like I found it very interesting when they were at primary school that there was an arts room, there's a music room, there's a library, there's outdoor ed, and actually the school was built so there was a science room, but there wasn't. It didn't sort of get used for science. It got, and a lot of the science projects at school weren't really science projects. But
Yeah.
there was a fabulous teacher that they had in year 4 who I remember on one of these open days, she had the students really engaged with it, doing very, I don't know, they were making popcorn or something, but she was explaining how making popcorn was
Yeah.
science in action,
Yeah.
sort of thing. So that's something. But I think it is hard to get women engaged in science as well, and I think that's a complex issue to try and tackle. But the other thing is, I think maybe in the future we're going to have to look for people outside of science and to work in our industry and think of different ways to recruit people and get people interested in the resources sector.
Yeah, because there won't be, as we sort of mostly acknowledged in the last 5 years, there won't be geologists, metallurgists, and engineers. There will be this whole range of disciplines that we probably haven't even heard of now that will be making their way into the
Yeah,
industry,
yeah,
and
yeah.
it's already happening. Data scientists. We employ data scientists, and
Absolutely.
never
Yeah.
thought that would be a thing.
Yeah,
And it's
and I think the younger generation as well don't necessarily see that they're going to have one career for their lives. They might want to be trained more broadly so that they can head in a variety of directions. And
yeah,
so,
yeah.
yeah,
Now,
yeah,
look,
yeah,
that I think that is definitely the problem of the generation. I mean, all the other problems, they've all resolved themselves, as the world spins around every day. But that one is tricky. And as much as I think we can influence it, it's such a really big, heavy pendulum swinging, and it will keep swinging until it will stop swinging and swing back. I think correcting that big machine of trying to get more people and then talking about going into schools and that advocacy, it's all well and good, but you know, new generations have different interests, and going to, I mean, it was Richard who actually said, I'm next door to a mine. The school is literally in Mount Isa, next door to the mine, and nobody knows what's going on or has any interest in it. So what can you do? And I think we have to acknowledge it, and I think we should care about it and change it. But I think we could also waste a hell of a lot of good time for something that is just going to keep swinging and do its thing. And people will move around the world to fill the gaps. I mean, we're now talking about skill shortage in Australia again. That will never change. And, you know, if it's not through graduates in Australia, it will be naturally through the immigration system. So, and that will at some point come to a head, and people will change the rules, and the 417 visas will change, and, you know, life goes on.
A few years ago, I went up to Indonesia to. I went and gave a Valmin talk and workshop at an Indonesian geological conference, and you know they had a wealth of Indonesian geology and mining engineering graduates, and so you know there are
huge industry.
Definitely huge industry and professionals getting trained there, and I'm sure you know the opportunity for them to come and work in somewhere like Australia, which is seen as a pretty sophisticated mining industry, and then return to their countries, you know, and Indonesia is just one example.
Like Turkey has got like 45,000 geologists, you know, that's 4 times more than we have members in the AUSMM, and I might have my numbers wrong there, but it's gigantic, so. But we need to be more open to that. And Jackie, I talked to Jackie Coombs about that the other day, and she's a real advocate for that sort of globalization of the workforce. And she meets so many good people in different jurisdictions. We're not tapping into that.
And the women in mining industry is quite interesting too, because in Australia it's been very proactive about trying to get women to mentor other women, and that's now extended, and it's been running for quite a few years on an international basis. So, you know, I did, when I was at BHP, I mentored a geologist in Mexico, and that was fantastic because, you know, and that was sort of just before all the communications that we take for granted now are around, but, you know, these sort of communications do allow these sorts of things to happen. So,
well, that's spot on. I mean, we are so closely connected to everybody else in the world right now that's so I think the problem will resolve itself, and as passionate as I am about it, and I think we should do something. It's you know, people will move, and it's if the flights become a bit cheaper, or if Qantas will pick themselves up by those socks. But hey, look, Deb, it's been fantastic to talk to you.
Thanks for the opportunity, René. Thank you.
No, it's been fun, and thanks for making the time. Maybe you should do it again one day. Look you up in Perth if you want to catch up for a drink. There's so much more to talk about. Really appreciate your thoughts.
Definitely. Great.
All right, see you again.
Okay, thanks for your time, René.
No worries, bye.